a gauge statement is given for each of these 5 panels. Chances are if the gauge of panel 1 matches the pattern gauge, then the gauge of all the other panels will match as well. However, it's a good idea to do a gauge swatch for each individual panel. Now you say, I hate doing a gauge swatch, and gauge doesn't really matter because this is a blanket. And it doesn't matter whether it's big or small. Well, it does matter because, for one thing, you want the fabric to be something that feels good. You don't want it to be too loose and you don't want it to be too stiff. Getting the same gauge as the pattern gauge will ensure that your fabric feels good. It will also ensure that you don't run out of yarn. The pattern is written for the number of balls needed when you work to the pattern gauge. If your gauge is different, you might end up running out of yarn, not to mention your blanket might be way too big or way too small. So let's take the time to match the pattern gauge of each panel. If you're using a different yarn, you may find that the gauge given in the pattern doesn't feel quite right for that yarn, and you'll have to use your own judgment to adjust the gauge. Maybe you'll have to change the gauge and then change the number of stitches in the pattern, or you may need to decide you want to use a different yarn. I'm only going to be talking about the gauge that I got for Plymouth Yarn Encore. If you have questions, leave them in the comments at the end of the blog post and we'll do our best to answer.